The desert wind carried the smell of burning metal and diesel fuel. Captain Michael Brennan pressed his face against the periscope of his Sherman tank, watching the world disintegrate into chaos. 88mm shells screamed overhead, each one a thunderclap that rattled teeth and liquefied guts. The radio crackled with voices of dying men, their final words transmitted across the static before being swallowed by silence. 300 meters ahead, Lieutenant David Goldman's tank erupted in a column of flame that climbed toward the pale African sky. The turret spun through the air like a discarded toy, tumbling end over end before crashing into the rocky ground. Brennan's hand reached for the radio transmit button, then froze. There would be no response. Goldman was gone. Just like that. One moment a living, breathing man with a wife named Rachel waiting in Brooklyn. The next moment, atoms scattered across the Tunisian wasteland. This was El Kasserine Pass, February 19, 1943, the day American armor learned what hell tasted like. But hell has a beginning, and every inferno starts with a single spark of arrogance. 6 months earlier, Boston had never seemed more distant than it did standing on the deck of the transport ship approaching the coast of North Africa. November 10, 1942. Brennan stood at the railing, watching the Mediterranean stretch endlessly in every direction, a sheet of hammered bronze under the afternoon sun. Behind him, the rumble of Sherman tanks secured to the deck, each one a 30-ton promise of American industrial might. Ahead, somewhere beyond that razor line where sea met sky, waited a war that would test every assumption he had ever made about courage, command, and what it meant to lead men into combat. His dress uniform felt stiff and foreign, the captain's bars on his collar still bright enough to catch sunlight. 29 years old, West Point class of 37, top 15%. Every evaluation marked him as officer material, destined for command, a natural leader. The words felt hollow now, standing alone at the rail while the Mediterranean wind tried to tear them away. In his breast pocket, folded into a careful square, was his father's last letter. Written in 1935, 8 years after the Great War had supposedly ended, 2 weeks before the gas attack, damage finally stopped his heart for good. Brennan didn't need to unfold it to remember every word. He had memorized them long ago, the way some men memorize prayers. Michael, if you become a soldier, remember this. Steel breaks. Men endure. When you give an order, you're not moving machines across a battlefield. You're asking human beings to risk everything they are and everything they'll ever be. Some will follow, some will die. You'll live with both. That's command. That's the price. Choose wisely, son. Choose men over metal. Always. His father had led a platoon at Belleau Wood. 1918, the battle that broke the German advance and cost the Marines more casualties than the entire history of the Corps up to that point. His father had ordered men forward into mustard gas, watching them claw at their throats as their lungs dissolved. He had lived. They had not. The guilt ate him slower than the residual gas in his scarred lungs, but just as thoroughly. Brennan looked down at the letter, then at his own reflection in the dark water below. Would he be strong enough? Would he make the right choices? Would he bring his men home? The questions followed him down the gangplank 3 days later in the port of Algiers, through the chaos of unloading equipment and organizing companies, into the first moment he stood before his crew and tried to see them as something more than names on a roster. Sergeant Daniel Kowalski, 35 years old, Polish immigrant from Chicago. Face like weathered stone, hands that had worked factory floors before they learned to aim a 75mm gun. He stood at attention beside the tank, but Brennan caught the slight sway, the telltale looseness in the shoulders, and the smell. Faint but unmistakable. Whiskey, probably from a flask hidden somewhere in his field jacket. Brennan should have said something, should have confronted it immediately, but Kowalski's service record showed 3 years in armor, combat experience and training exercises that most officers never saw. They needed experienced gunners. The Army needed every trained man. So Brennan said nothing, filing the observation away as a problem for later, when there was time to address the small things that seemed unimportant in the shadow of the larger war. Sergeant James Washington, 35 years old, driver. From Georgia, though his accent had been worn smooth by years up north, trying to disappear into the background noise of a segregated army. He met Brennan's eyes for exactly 1 second, long enough to show respect, short enough to maintain the careful distance that black soldiers learned to keep from white officers. His handshake was firm, his posture perfect, his expression completely unreadable. Something in that blankness bothered Brennan more than Kowalski's drinking. It felt like looking at a locked door and knowing something vital waited on the other side. But there was no time to knock, no time to ask the questions that might have built a bridge. Instead, Brennan nodded and moved on, adding Washington to the list of things he would understand later, when the pressure eased and command became something more than checking boxes on a manifest. Corporal Robert Chen, 20 years old, loader, from San Francisco, Chinese-American, fourth generation, spoke English with no trace of accent, but carried himself with the careful awareness of someone who had spent his entire life being seen as foreign. He looked impossibly young, barely old enough to shave, eyes wide with an eagerness that would either be beaten out of him by combat or forged into something harder. When Brennan shook his hand, Chen's grip trembled slightly. Brennan smiled, trying to project confidence he did not entirely feel. The kid's last name rang familiar, tugging at the edge of memory, but there were 10,000 Chens in California, and no reason this particular one should mean anything special. So he clapped the boy on the shoulder and told him he would do fine, that they all would, that the Sherman was the best tank in the world, and they had nothing to fear from an enemy already beaten at El Alamein. The lies came easily. Command required them. Men needed certainty, needed to believe their officers knew something they did not. So Brennan projected that certainty, standing tall beside the tank they had named Ironclad after the Civil War ship that had revolutionized naval warfare. Another machine that had promised invincibility. Another weapon that men had believed would end wars quickly. The Sherman crouched on its treads like a predator, 30 tons of welded steel and American engineering. 75mm gun, 3 inches of frontal armor, top speed of 38 miles per hour on flat ground. The specifications read like poetry to men who had never seen what an 88mm anti-tank gun could do to 3 inches of armor at 2,000 meters. Brennan ran his hand along the hull, feeling the cold metal under his palm. This machine would keep them alive. This machine would carry them through whatever waited in the mountain passes of Tunisia. He believed it with the same fierce certainty that had carried him through 4 years at West Point, through every training exercise, through every classroom lecture on armored tactics and combined arms warfare. He believed it completely, right up until the moment it stopped being true. The briefing room in Algiers smelled of stale cigarette smoke and mimeograph ink. Maps covered every wall, blue and red lines marking friendly and enemy positions, arrows indicating attack routes and supply lines. Major General Theodore Patterson stood at the front, pointer in hand, face carved from granite and controversy. 57 years old, 30 years in the Army, a reputation for being brilliant, ruthless, and completely intolerant of failure. Patterson's eyes swept across the assembled officers, lingering for just a moment on Brennan. There was something in that gaze, a weight that pressed down like a physical thing. Later, Brennan would understand. Later, he would learn that Patterson had lost a son at Pearl Harbor, that every young officer was both a surrogate for that loss and a tool to be used in evening the score. But in that moment, Brennan only felt the pressure and straightened his shoulders to bear it. The briefing was simple. Rommel's Afrika Corps, beaten at El Alamein, was retreating west into Tunisia. The British Eighth Army pursued from the east. American forces, fresh and untested, would advance from the west through the mountain passes, cutting off the retreat and crushing the Germans between two unstoppable forces. Simple, clean, the kind of plan that looked perfect on paper and fell apart the moment it touched reality. Brennan volunteered C Company for the first patrol through Faid Pass. Patterson's eyes narrowed slightly, then he nodded. After the briefing, he pulled Brennan aside, away from the other officers. "Your father was John Brennan, 1st Marines, Belleau Wood." It was not a question. Brennan nodded, unsure where this was leading. Patterson's expression softened for just a moment, a crack in the granite that closed almost immediately. "I served with him in France. He saved my life at Chateau Thierry, led a counterattack that should have gotten him killed. Instead, it got me home alive, and him a lungful of gas that killed him 11 years later." Brennan felt something shift in his chest, a reordering of the world. This was why he had been chosen. Not merit, not potential, legacy, debt. Patterson's hand gripped his shoulder. I'm giving you C Company because your father was the best combat officer I ever served with. Don't make me regret it. Don't make his sacrifice meaningless by getting yourself killed doing something stupid." The weight of those words followed Brennan back to his quarters, followed him through the next 2 months of patrols and skirmishes, followed him all the way to the morning of January 30th, when C Company rolled through Faid Pass and into the carefully prepared killing ground that would teach him the difference between confidence and competence. Dawn broke cold over the Tunisian desert, the kind of cold that seeped through layers of wool and canvas, settling into bones and making men question why they had ever left home. 12 Shermans in a staggered column, engines rumbling, treads clanking against stone. Brennan stood in the commander's hatch of ironclad, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the ridgelines on either side of the pass. The landscape looked like the surface of some dead planet. Rocky hills studded with scrub brush and cactus, wadis cutting through the terrain like knife wounds. Everything painted in shades of tan and gray under a sky that seemed too big, too empty, too indifferent to the small dramas of men and machines. Kowalski sat at the gunner's position below, voice crackling over the intercom. "Sir, those wadis. Perfect ambush positions. We should recon before we push through." Brennan heard the concern, heard the experience speaking, but he also heard the book, the doctrine, the training that said aggressive action kept initiative, that hesitation gave the enemy time to prepare, and beneath that, something else, the need to prove himself, to show Patterson and the company and himself that he deserved this command. "Sergeant, I went to West Point. I studied Rommel's tactics. He's retreating. These are his rear guards at best. We push through fast. We catch them off balance. Trust the plan." The words sounded confident over the radio, but in the silence after, standing in the hatch with the wind pulling at his uniform, Brennan felt the first whisper of doubt. Washington's voice came through a moment later, quiet and measured. "Engine's ready, sir, but I'm seeing a lot of good hiding spots out there." "Just saying." Brennan's jaw tightened. Was this how command worked? Every decision questioned? Every order requiring justification? His father had led Marines who followed without hesitation, who trusted their officers to make the right calls. But his father had also written that letter, had warned about the price of command, had died knowing that perfect orders existed only in textbooks. The moment passed. Brennan keyed the company radio. "All units, advance by sections. Maintain interval. Eyes open. First section, move out." Ironclad's engine roared, and they rolled forward into the pass. Washington's driving was smooth, professional, threading the Sherman between rocks and around obstacles with the kind of skill that only came from natural talent and endless practice. Chen stood ready at the loader's position, 75mm shells stacked and waiting. Kowalski tracked the gun left and right, covering potential threats, movements just a fraction slower than they should have been. The flask. Brennan remembered it now, remembered the smell of whiskey and the slight unsteadiness, and felt a spike of anger that he swallowed down. Later. They would deal with it later. Right now, they had a mission. The world exploded without warning. One moment, the pass stretched ahead, empty and quiet. The next, fire and thunder and the screaming sound of incoming shells. The lead Sherman, 200 meters ahead, simply ceased to exist. One instant, it was a tank. The next, a ball of flame and flying metal. The turrets separated from the hull, spinning upward in a lazy arc that seemed to take forever before gravity reasserted itself and brought it crashing back to Earth. Brennan's mind froze. This was not supposed to happen. The enemy was retreating. The intelligence had said rear guards, small units, nothing like this. But intelligence was wrong, had always been wrong, would always be wrong because no amount of aerial photography could capture the reality of men who had spent 3 years learning how to kill tanks. The 88s opened up from positions on both sides of the pass, camouflaged, carefully positioned, overlapping fields of fire that turned the narrow defile into a shooting gallery. German anti-tank doctrine at its finest, and American armor bunched up in the pass, unable to maneuver, presenting perfect targets. Kowalski's voice cut through the chaos. "Contact left, 88 in the cactus grove, range 800 meters. Brennan tried to respond, but his throat had closed. He watched another Sherman explode, watched the crew bail out with uniforms on fire, watched them fall under machine gun fire before they had taken 3 steps. His hands gripped the hatch rim hard enough to hurt, knuckles white, body frozen in the awful space between thought and action. Washington's voice, urgent now. "Sir, orders. We need orders." The radio filled with screaming, voices overlapping, men calling for help, reporting hits, begging for permission to withdraw. And underneath it all, the steady thunder of the 88s, German guns that could kill a Sherman at ranges where the American 75mm could barely scratch paint. "Captain!" Kowalski again louder. "I need permission to engage." Brennan's mind spun. Forward? Back? Return fire? Smoke? Every option seemed wrong, every choice a path to disaster. This was not how it was supposed to be, not how the textbooks described it, not how his father's war had been, where men charged and died, but at least understood what they were dying for. Washington made the decision for him. The Sherman lurched into reverse, transmissions screaming, treads throwing up dust and stones as they backed away from the killing ground. Not retreat, survival, the difference between running away and living to fight again. But the terrain betrayed them. Washington, backing blind, could not see the shell crater behind them. The Sherman's rear treads dropped into the depression, the whole tank tipping backward at an angle that threw Brennan against the hatch rim. His head cracked against metal. Stars exploded across his vision. Blood ran warm down his face, mixing with sweat and dust. Through the haze of concussion, he heard Chen's voice, high and terrified. "We're hit! We're gonna die! Oh God, we're gonna die!" Then Kowalski, steady despite the fear that had to be racing through him. "Bobby, listen to me. Load AP round. Do it now, we're not dead yet." The tank rocked as Washington fought the controls, engine howling, trying to pull them out of the crater. Another shell passed overhead, so close Brennan felt the pressure wave. It impacted 50 meters behind them, showering the Sherman with rock fragments that pinged off the armor like deadly hail. Washington's voice, calm in a way that cut through the panic. "Sir, I can get us out, but I need you with me. I need you to command." The words hit harder than the concussion. Command, that was his job. That was why he wore the bars, why men called him sir, why his father's ghost watched from beyond the grave, waiting to see if his son had inherited anything beyond the name. Brennan forced his eyes to focus, forced his hands to stop shaking, forced words through his dry throat. "All units, withdraw by sections, covering fire and movement. Fall back to Rally Point Alpha." The order went out. Some units responded, others did not. The ones that did not would never respond again. Washington got them out of the crater through a combination of skill and desperation, the Sherman clawing its way back onto level ground. They retreated in a cloud of dust and diesel smoke, the pass behind them littered with burning wrecks and the scattered remains of what had been, just minutes before, living men. When they reached the rally point 5 kilometers back, Brennan climbed out of the tank on shaking legs and promptly vomited into the dust. His crew said nothing, giving him the dignity of distance. Around them, the survivors of C Company gathered. 8 tanks out of 12, 34 men dead. First combat action, first catastrophic failure. Brennan sat in the shade of Ironclad's hull, head in his hands, and tried to understand what had just happened. They had the better tanks, the better equipment, the weight of American industry behind them. How had it gone so wrong? Kowalski approached after a while, canteen in hand. He said nothing, just offered water. Brennan drank, tasting blood and bile and shame. When he handed the canteen back, he met Kowalski's eyes for the first time. "I should have listened to you. About the waddies." Kowalski's expression did not change. "Yes, sir, you should have." The honesty was more painful than sympathy would have been, but it was also necessary. Command without honest feedback was just dictatorship waiting to fail. Washington joined them, wiping grease from his hands. Chen hung back, still pale, still shaking from the adrenaline crash. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Washington broke the silence. "Sir, we lived. That's something." Brennan looked up at him, seeing the man clearly for the first time. Not just a name on a roster, not just a driver, a human being who had just saved all their lives by acting when his officer could not. "Thank you, Sergeant. You saved us." Washington's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Acknowledgement, the beginning of respect, earned not through rank but through admission of failure and debt. "Just doing my job, sir." But it was more than that, and they both knew it. Washington had disobeyed a direct order. In a different army, under a different officer, That would mean court-martial. Instead, it had meant survival. The rules of combat were being rewritten in real time, and Brennan was learning that the textbooks had never prepared him for the reality of men screaming and metal burning and the awful mathematics of casualty counts. That night, they buried the dead in shallow graves marked with improvised crosses. Brennan stood at attention while a chaplain said words that felt empty, watching the sun set over a desert that did not care about American boys dying far from home. When it was over, when the last prayer had been spoken and the last handful of dirt thrown, he walked alone to where Lieutenant David Goldman's body lay wrapped in canvas. Goldman had been his friend at West Point. Same year, same dream of service. Goldman had married his high school sweetheart the week before deployment, a girl named Rachel from Brooklyn who wrote him letters every day. Brennan had been best man at the wedding, had promised to watch Goldman's back, had sworn they would both come home with stories to tell. He unwrapped the canvas enough to see Goldman's face, or what was left of it. The 88 had hit the turret dead center, and the explosion had been catastrophic. Brennan reached into Goldman's pocket, finding the letter Rachel had sent, still sealed, never opened. Goldman would never read it now, would never know what she had written in her careful script about the life they would build when this was over. Brennan pocketed the letter along with Goldman's dog tags. Someone would have to write to Rachel. Someone would have to tell her that her husband had died following orders, that it had been quick, that he had not suffered. All lies, all necessary, all part of command. The stars came out, cold and distant and indifferent. Brennan sat beside his friend's body and felt the weight of command settle onto his shoulders like physical chains. This was the price his father had warned about. This was what it meant to lead. Not glory, not victory parades, just the endless accumulation of names and faces, the arithmetic of bodies, the knowledge that every decision carried consequences measured in lives. He should have felt something more. Grief, rage, something. But all he felt was numb, hollowed out. A shell that wore captain's bars and pretended to know what it was doing. Kowalski found him there an hour later. "Sir, you should get some rest. We move out at dawn." Brennan did not look up. "I got Goldman killed. I got all of them killed." Kowalski sat down beside him, joints popping. "No, sir. You didn't. Bad intelligence did. Bad tactics did. Being green did. But not you. Not personally." The distinction felt meaningless. "I gave the order to advance. And I was drunk when I should have been sharp. And Washington tried to warn you, but you didn't listen. And Chen panicked instead of loading. We all failed, sir. That's combat. That's war. The question isn't whether you failed, it's whether you learn from it." Brennan looked at him then, really looked. Kowalski's face was lined with more than age. There were stories there, failures and regrets and lessons learned the hard way. This was not his first war, not his first dead friend. How do you live with it? Kowalski pulled out his flask, looked at it for a long moment, then screwed the cap back on without drinking. You don't, not really. You just keep going, because the alternative is giving up, and then they died for nothing. The words settled like stones. Brennan nodded slowly, not agreeing but acknowledging. He stood, brushing dust from his uniform, and took one last look at Goldman's shrouded form. "I'll write to Rachel. I'll tell her he was brave." Kowalski stood as well. Was he? Brave? Brennan thought about it. About the moments before the ambush. About Goldman volunteering for point position because he wanted to prove himself. About the split second between life and death that had been decided by nothing more than position in the column. He tried to be. That's all any of us can do. They walked back to the company area together. Two men carrying different burdens, neither one sure how to carry them. Behind them, the desert wind whispered across the graves, already beginning to erase the marks of temporary burial. In a year, no one would know men had died here. In 10 years, the desert would have swallowed every trace. But Brennan would remember, would carry those names, would add them to the weight his father had carried from Belleau Wood. That was command. That was the price. And the bill was only beginning to come due. 2 weeks passed in a blur of patrols and skirmishes, small firefights that accomplished nothing, but added more names to the casualty lists. The army was learning slowly and painfully that Rommel's retreat was not a rout, but a fighting withdrawal. That every mile of desert came at a cost measured in blood and burning steel. February 14th, Valentine's Day. Somewhere back home, couples exchanged cards and flowers and promises of futures together. In Tunisia, C Company received orders to participate in a major counterattack at Sidi Bouzid. The objective was simple: 58 Shermans in a massed assault, pushing through the pass to break German positions and restore American momentum. The night before, Brennan sat in his tent writing letters. One to Rachel Goldman, telling careful lies about how David had died. One to his mother, saying nothing of importance, just filling space with words that would not alarm her. And one he could not send to someone he should not be writing to, a girl named Sarah Chen, whose face haunted him more than the dead. They had met the previous summer at a restaurant in San Francisco where she worked as a hostess, Chinese-American, fourth generation, spoke English with the kind of precision that came from constantly having to prove she belonged. They had talked for hours that first night about everything and nothing, about dreams and futures and what it meant to be American when half the country did not believe you could be. They had fallen in love quietly, knowing it could not last, knowing that an officer and a Chinese girl could never have a future in an America that made such things illegal in 17 states. But for a few months they had pretended, had walked on beaches and shared meals and talked about the impossible. When his deployment orders came through, she had made him promise only one thing. Her younger brother, Bobby, was enlisting. If they ended up in the same unit, he would watch out for him, would keep him safe, would bring him home. Brennan had made that promise easily, never thinking it would come true, never imagining that the random machinery of Army assignments would place Bobby Chen in his company, in his crew, loading shells in the tank he commanded. Now Bobby sat outside the tent, cleaning the 75mm breech, still looking impossibly young despite the weeks of combat. Still Sarah's little brother, still someone Brennan had sworn to protect, still a living reminder of a promise that became heavier with every engagement. He put the letter away unfinished. Some things could not be written. Some promises could not be kept. All he could do was try. The morning of the assault was clear and cold. 58 Shermans formed up in the classic V formation, the kind of textbook maneuver that looked impressive on paper and got men killed in reality. Brennan stood in the commander's hatch, watching the other tanks take their positions, feeling the familiar twist of dread in his gut. Kowalski's voice was steady over the intercom. "Sir, this is going to be bad. That's a lot of tanks in a tight space. If there's an ambush—" "I know, Danny, I know." The use of the first name was new, a small acknowledgement of the bond forming between them. Not friendship exactly, something harder, the connection between men who had survived hell together and knew they would face it again. Washington's voice joined them. "Engine ready, Captain, but I'm with Danny. This feels wrong." Chen said nothing, but Brennan could hear him breathing hard over the radio, could imagine the fear running through the kid's mind. Bobby was getting better, had been steady under fire in the skirmishes. But this was different. This was a major assault. This was the kind of fight where Shermans died by the dozen. The radio crackled with the order to advance. 58 engines roared to life in unison, a sound like the world ending or beginning, impossible to tell which. They rolled forward in their perfect V, throwing up a dust cloud that rose hundreds of feet, a brown fog that obscured vision and made targets of them all. Brennan knew it was wrong, knew it with the same certainty his father must have felt at Belleau Wood, watching Marines fix bayonets for a charge across open ground into machine gun fire. But knowing did not matter. Orders were orders. Command meant following them, even when they led to disaster. The German panzers waited in carefully prepared positions on both flanks. Panzer IV tanks with long-barreled 75mm guns that could penetrate Sherman armor at ranges the American guns could never match. They waited until the American column was fully committed, trapped in the narrow space between the rocky hills, blind in their own dust cloud. Then they opened fire. The massacre was systematic and thorough. German commanders had studied American tactics, had noted the preference for mass charges and overwhelming firepower, had prepared positions that turned those tactics into suicide. The panzers fired from hull-down positions, only their turrets visible, presenting minimal targets, while their guns reached out across 800 meters to punch through American armor like it was paper. Brennan watched through his periscope as Sherman after Sherman exploded, watched crews bail out and die under machine gun fire. Watched the perfect V formation disintegrate into chaos as tanks tried to scatter, tried to find cover, tried to do anything except die. Kowalski was firing as fast as Chen could load, his accuracy terrifying and perfect. 3 shots, 3 hits on a Panzer forearm at 700 meters. The German shells bounced off its frontal armor, ricocheting away without effect. The German return fire was equally accurate. Their shot hit Ironclad's glacis plate, the sound like a church bell struck by God's own hammer. The shell penetrated but failed to detonate. A dud round, a miracle of manufacturing defect, the kind of luck that meant the difference between life and death. It lodged in the internal bracing, smoking and hot, but inert. If it had exploded, they would all be dead. If it had been properly made, there would be no second chance. Chen screamed, a high, wordless sound of pure terror. Washington fought the controls, weaving between burning wrecks, using dead tanks as cover. Kowalski kept shooting, kept calling targets, kept trying to do something against an enemy that was methodically destroying an entire American task force. "Sir, we need to withdraw." Washington's voice cut through the chaos. "We can't win this." Brennan wanted to give that order, wanted to save his crew, save what was left of the company, save himself, but the radio was calling for units to press forward, to maintain the assault, to push through and break the German lines. Command wanted victory, command demanded it, and who was a captain to refuse? "Bobby, next target. Panzer at 3 o'clock. Distance 600 meters. Chen loaded, hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the shell. "Got it? Up!" Kowalski fired. Another hit, another useless ricochet off German armor. The return shot missed by inches, close enough that the pressure wave shook the entire tank. They could not win. That was becoming obvious. Could not even hurt the enemy in any meaningful way. But they could die trying. That seemed to be what command expected, what duty demanded. It was Washington who made the choice again. Made it without asking permission, without waiting for orders. He saw an opening, a gap between burning Shermans, a path that led back toward friendly lines. And he took it, throwing the transmission into reverse, backing them out of the killing ground while Kowalski kept firing to cover their retreat. "Fall back! Fall back!" The radio finally gave the order everyone had been screaming for. "Fall back to rally point!" The survivors scattered, each tank for itself, racing across the desert while the panzers methodically destroyed the ones too damaged or unlucky to escape. Out of 58 Shermans, 13 made it back. 45 burning wrecks left behind, along with the bodies of men who had believed in American armor, in American tactics, in American invincibility. Brennan climbed out of the tank at the rally point and saw Chen doubled over, vomiting into the dust. Saw Washington's face, drawn and pale beneath the dust. Saw Kowalski sitting on the hull, hands shaking too badly to light a cigarette. And he saw the other survivors, saw the accusation in their eyes, the question no one was asking out loud. Why had they been sent in like that? Why had command insisted on tactics that turned tanks into coffins? Why had captains followed those orders when every man in the column knew it was wrong? Brennan had no answers, only the weight of more names, more faces, more letters to write to families that would never understand how their sons and husbands and fathers had died. That night, Colonel Harrison pulled him aside. The colonel's face was gray, aged a decade in a single day. He spoke in a voice drained of everything except exhaustion. "Brennan, I'm recommending you for promotion. You kept your crew alive. That's worth something." The words felt like ash. "Sir, we lost 45 tanks. I know, I was there. But you survived. Your men survived. That's victory enough these days." It was not victory. It was not even a draw. It was slaughter, pure and simple. And calling it anything else was lying to themselves. But Brennan said nothing, just nodded and walked back to his tent and sat in the darkness, listening to the sound of men crying in nearby tents, the sound of trauma working its way through the ranks like a disease. Chen found him there an hour later. The kid's eyes were red, face still pale. He sat down without asking permission. "Captain, I nearly got us killed. I dropped that shell. I froze. You loaded when it mattered. That's all that counts. But I was scared, so scared I couldn't breathe." Brennan looked at him, seeing Sarah's features in her brother's face, seeing the promise he had made and how little it meant against the reality of combat. "Being scared means you're smart, Bobby. The ones who aren't scared are the ones who get us killed." Chen nodded slowly, not quite believing, but wanting to. "Captain, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead. Do you think we're going to die out here? All of us?" The honest answer was probably. The kind answer was a lie. Brennan chose something in between. "I think we're going to fight. And some of us will make it home, and we'll carry the ones who don't with us forever. That's all I know. It was not much, but it was true, and truth was all he had left to give. The knock came at 0600 hours, February 23rd. Brennan had been awake all night, writing letters to the families of the dead, trying to find words that would explain the unexplainable. He looked up to see a lieutenant he did not recognize standing at attention. "Captain Brennan, Major General Patterson requests your presence immediately." Patterson's command tent was organized chaos, maps and reports covering every surface, staff officers moving with barely controlled urgency. The general himself stood at the main map table, his face the same granite mask Brennan remembered from the first briefing months ago. But there was something new there now. Cracks in the stone. The weight of defeat. Patterson dismissed the staff officers, leaving them alone. He did not offer Brennan a seat, just looked at him for a long moment, weighing and measuring. "Captain, I'm relieving you of command." The words hit like a physical blow. Brennan stood straighter, keeping his face neutral, even as his world collapsed. "Sir, Patterson held up a hand. "You're a good officer, Mike. You follow orders. You respect the chain of command. You do everything the book says you should do. But you're not a good commander, not yet." He pulled something from his pocket. Brennan's father's Purple Heart. The ribbon faded, the metal tarnished. Patterson held it up to the light coming through the tent opening. "Your father gave this to me before Below Wood. Said if he didn't make it back, I should give it to his son when he was ready. When he had learned what command really costs." He set the medal on the table between them. "You're not ready, Mike. You're good at following orders, even bad ones. But command isn't about following orders. It's about knowing when to question them, when to protect your men from the stupidity of people who outrank you." Brennan felt anger rising. "Sir, I followed protocol. I did everything I was trained to do. That's the problem. You followed. Your father led. He questioned orders at Bellow Wood, argued with the colonel about sending men across open ground. Got overruled and did it anyway, but he made sure every Marine knew it was a bad order, that they were following it because duty demanded it, not because it made sense." Patterson leaned forward. "You've lost 50 men in 2 weeks, Mike. Good men, brave men, men who trusted you to lead them. And you led them straight into slaughter because you believed the book more than you believed your own eyes." The accusation burned because it was true. Brennan had seen the ambush positions, had heard Kowalski's warnings, had felt Washington's hesitation. And he had ignored all of it because the orders said advance, because command said it would work, because West Point had taught him that aggressive action overcame obstacles. "Report to training at 0600 tomorrow. You'll observe other commanders. Learn from them, and when I think you're ready, maybe I'll give you back your company." Patterson picked up the Purple Heart, holding it out. "Take this. Study it. Remember what it cost your father to earn it. And ask yourself if you're willing to pay the same price to earn the right to wear it." Brennan took the medal, feeling the weight of it, the history, the blood. "Sir, what about my crew?" "They'll be reassigned. Kowalski to 3rd Platoon, Washington to Motor Pool, Chen to Supply. You've gotten them shot at enough for now." The dismissal was clear. Brennan saluted and left, walking out into the morning light with his father's medal burning a hole in his pocket and the taste of failure thick in his mouth. But as he walked across the compound, something caught his attention. A column of retreating vehicles, damaged tanks being towed back from Faid Pass, and among them, a lone figure. Chen, standing guard over a pile of burned and twisted metal. Radio equipment, encryption rotors, code books reduced to ash. Brennan approached. "Bobby, what are you doing here? I thought you were with the company." Chen looked up, face streaked with soot and blood. His hands were wrapped in bandages, burns visible on his forearms. "Sir, during the retreat, someone needed to stay behind and destroy the classified equipment. The radio codes, the encryption gear. If the Germans captured it..." He trailed off, gesturing to the destroyed equipment. Brennan understood immediately. This wasn't supply duty. This was something else entirely. Chen had volunteered to stay behind, alone under fire, while the company retreated over the mountain. Had spent precious minutes smashing machinery and burning documents, while German infantry swept the area searching for prisoners and intelligence. "You did this alone under fire?" "Yes, sir. The equipment officer was wounded. Someone had to do it. I figured..." He looked down at his burned hands. I figured if I was going to be scared, I might as well be scared doing something important. Brennan felt something shift in his chest. This was not the terrified kid who had screamed in panic at Sidi Bou Zid. This was a soldier who had made a hard choice and followed through, accepting the risk because the mission demanded what? You could have been captured, killed. Chen shrugged, the gesture exhausted. Yes, sir, but I wasn't. And the Germans didn't get our codes. That has to count for something. It counts for everything, Bobby. You saved lives, maybe hundreds of them. Intelligence said the Germans were trying to break our encryption. You made sure they couldn't. An MP lieutenant approached, saluting Brennan. Sir, I've documented Corporal Chen's actions, recommending him for the Bronze Star. He destroyed 2 radio sets, 3 encryption rotors, and approximately 50 classified documents while under direct enemy fire. Showed exceptional courage and devotion to duty. Brennan looked at Chen with new eyes. Not Sarah's little brother, not a scared kid. A soldier who had found his courage in the moment it mattered most. Approved, Lieutenant, and promote him to sergeant. He's earned it. Chen's eyes widened. Sir, I'm just a loader. You were a loader. Now you're a soldier who understands that duty sometimes means standing alone in the fire while everyone else runs. That's worth sergeant's stripes. After the MP left, Brennan stood with Chen in silence for a moment. The younger man looked at him with something like understanding. Captain, Sarah told me you'd keep me safe, but maybe that's not what I needed. Maybe I needed to learn how to keep myself safe, how to be worth saving. The words carried more weight than Chen probably understood. Brennan had been trying to protect him, to honor a promise to Sarah, to keep the kid wrapped in safety that combat made impossible. But Chen had grown beyond that need, had become something more than the boy who left San Francisco. You're already worth it, Bobby. You always were. They walked back to the company area together, 2 men changed by the same battles, both carrying scars that would never fully heal, but had forged them into something harder than they had been. Behind them, the destroyed radio equipment smoldered in the morning sun, a small pile of ash that represented lives saved and codes kept secret in one young soldier's moment of becoming someone his sister would be proud of. This was the price his father had warned about. This was what command cost, not glory, not respect, just the endless knowledge that every decision carried consequences. And sometimes those consequences were measured in the length of a casualty list, in the weight of a tarnished metal that represented everything you had failed to become. The sun rose higher, indifferent and eternal. The war continued, grinding men and metal into dust, and Captain Michael Brennan learned the first real lesson of command. Steel breaks, men endure, and sometimes the steel that breaks is you. The training compound sat 10 kilometers behind the front lines, far enough from combat that men could sleep without the constant thunder of artillery, close enough that the smell of cordite still drifted on the wind. Captain Michael Brennan stood outside the barracks at dawn, watching other officers lead their companies through drills, while his own crew scattered to different assignments, punishment disguised as reorganization. 3 days had passed since Patterson had relieved him of command. 3 days of watching from the sidelines while better men did the job he had failed at. The Purple Heart sat in his footlocker, wrapped in his father's last letter, both of them reminders of a legacy he had not earned and might never deserve. Patterson's training methodology was simple and brutal. He assigned Brennan as an observer, forcing him to watch other commanders make decisions, to see how experienced officers balanced aggression with caution, how they listened to their crews, how they built trust through competence rather than rank. Major Richard Hayes commanded 2nd Battalion. 42 years old, veteran of the First World War, face like weathered leather and eyes that missed nothing. Brennan shadowed him for a week, watching him interact with his men, noting how Hayes knew every sergeant by name, remembered details about their families, asked their opinions before making tactical decisions. On the 5th day, Hayes invited Brennan into his command tank for a live fire exercise. They rolled out into the training range at dawn, 4 Shermans working in coordinated pairs, practicing the fire and maneuver tactics that doctrine preached, but few units executed properly. Hayes stood in the commander's hatch, calling orders in a voice that carried authority without arrogance. 2nd section, advance to phase line alpha. 1st section, overwatch position, suppress targets on the ridgeline. The tanks moved like dancers, one pair advancing, while the other provided covering fire, leapfrogging forward in a rhythm that minimized exposure while maintaining offensive pressure. It was beautiful in its efficiency, a demonstration of what armor could accomplish when properly led. Brennan watched Hayes's crew work. The gunner, Korps, a corporal from Tennessee, called out targets and waited for confirmation before firing. The loader, a private who looked barely old enough to shave, moved with practiced efficiency born from endless repetition. The driver, a sergeant older than Hayes himself, positioned the tank without being told, reading the terrain and the tactical situation like a book written in his native language. This was what a crew looked like when they trusted each other, when they had worked together long enough that communication became instinct, when each man knew his role and the roles of everyone around him. After the exercise, Hayes climbed down and lit a cigarette, offering one to Brennan. They smoked in silence for a moment, watching the other tanks return to the staging area. "You're wondering why my crew works so well together?" It was not a question. Brennan nodded. Hayes exhaled smoke toward the sky. "It's not because I went to West Point or because I'm smarter than them. It's because I shut up and listen. That driver, Sergeant Monroe, he's been driving tanks since before you were born. He forgets more about terrain reading every day than I'll ever know. So when he suggests a route, I take it. When my gunner says he needs another second to acquire the target properly, I give it to him. Command isn't about knowing everything. It's about trusting the men who do." The words hit like hammer blows, each one driving home lessons that West Point had never taught. Brennan thought about Kowalski's warnings at Faid Pass, about Washington's hesitation at Sidi Bouzid, about all the moments when his crew had tried to tell him something and he had been too arrogant to hear. How do you build that trust after you've lost it? Hayes looked at him directly. You earn it back. One decision at a time. One admission of ignorance at a time. One moment of listening when your instinct is to command. It's harder than losing it, I'll tell you that. But it's possible. If you're willing to be humble enough to try. Brennan crushed out his cigarette. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet. Patterson says you've got potential. I'm not convinced. Prove me wrong." The next week brought a different kind of education. Patterson assigned Brennan to the motor pool where Washington had been reassigned, working as a mechanic on damaged Shermans. Brennan arrived at 0600 to find Washington elbow deep in an engine, grease coating his arms to the shoulders. Washington looked up, surprise flickering across his face before he controlled it. "Captain, didn't expect to see you here." "General's orders. I'm supposed to learn vehicle maintenance." Washington's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in his eyes. "Hand me that torque wrench." They worked in silence for an hour, Washington teaching without seeming to teach, showing Brennan how to diagnose engine problems by sound, how to field strip a transmission, how to keep a Sherman running when spare parts were scarce and time was shorter. Around them, other mechanics worked on damaged tanks, the motor pool a triage center for wounded steel. Brennan saw tanks he recognized, vehicles from companies he had trained with, each one bearing scars from encounters with German guns, penetrations welded over, turrets replaced, entire hulls stripped for parts. "This one came from your company." Washington gestured to a Sherman with its entire front glacis plate caved in, metal bent inward like crumpled paper. 88 hit at Sidi Bouzid. Crew didn't make it. Brennan studied the damage, imagining the moment of impact, the shell punching through armor that was supposed to be invulnerable, the instant when 3 inches of steel became 3 inches of nothing. "How many tanks have you worked on since you've been here?" Washington wiped his hands on a rag. 27. 19 of them had dead crew members still inside when they came in. "We clean that up before we repair the mechanical damage." The matter-of-fact tone carried its own weight. This was what happened after the battles Brennan fought. Someone had to scrape the remains of burned men out of steel coffins. Someone had to make the machines ready to go back out and create more bodies for other mechanics to clean up. I didn't know. Most officers don't. They see tanks. I see coffins that haven't killed their crews yet. The accusation hung in the air between them. Brennan wanted to defend himself, to explain that he had just been following orders, that the tactics had come from higher up. But Washington had been there, had seen Brennan freeze at Faid Pass, had saved his life and received no thanks for disobeying orders. "Sergeant, I owe you an apology." Washington's hands stilled on the engine he was working on. He did not look up. "For what, sir?" "For not listening. At Faid Pass, at Sidi Bouzid, you tried to warn me and I ignored you. Men died because I thought my West Point education made me smarter than your experience." The silence stretched long enough that Brennan thought Washington might not respond. Then the sergeant straightened, meeting his eyes for the first time since he had arrived at the motor pool. "Sir, you want to know why I didn't say anything after you ignored me? Why I just kept driving and kept my mouth shut? Tell me." "Because you're white and I'm not. Because in this army, a black sergeant who talks back to a white officer gets court-martialed or worse. Because I learned a long time ago that survival means knowing when to speak and when to shut up and follow orders that'll get you killed." The words carried decades of weight, generations of injustice compressed into a single moment of honesty. Brennan felt the shame of it settle in his chest, not personal shame for something he had done, but collective shame for a system that turned competence into a liability based on skin color. "That's not right." "No, sir, it's not. But it's real. And real doesn't care about right." Washington went back to work on the engine. Brennan stood there, unsure what to say, knowing that apologies were meaningless against the machinery of institutional racism. But he could offer something else, something small but genuine. "Teach me everything you know about keeping these machines running. And next time I get a command, if there is a next time, I'll listen. I swear it." Washington looked at him again, measuring, weighing the sincerity of the offer. Finally, he nodded. "All right, Captain. Hand me that compression tester. Let's see if you can learn." They worked together for the next 2 weeks. Washington taught and Brennan learned, and slowly something changed between them. Not friendship exactly. The Army and society had built too many walls for that, but respect, recognition, the beginning of the trust that Hayes had talked about. One evening, as they were cleaning up after a long day of maintenance, Washington pulled out a worn photograph from his wallet, a woman and a small child, both smiling at the camera. "That's my wife, Louise, and my son. We named him Michael after you." The revelation hit Brennan like a physical blow. "After me? Why?" Washington carefully put the photograph away. "Because Louise said we should name him after someone who represented what we were fighting for. Not the Army, not the white officers who don't see us as men, but the idea that someday, maybe, America could be the country it claims to be, where a black kid named Michael can grow up and be judged by what he does, not what he looks like." He met Brennan's eyes. "I didn't tell you before because I didn't want you thinking I was trying to curry favor. But you asked me once how I live with the fear, with following orders I know are wrong. That's how. I fight so my son can have something better, even if I don't live to see it." The weight of that trust, that faith, was almost unbearable. Brennan thought about all the ways he had failed, all the men who had died because he had been too proud to listen. And here was Washington, who had every reason to hate him, offering grace instead. "I don't deserve that faith." "No, sir, you don't. Not yet. But maybe you will. That's what I'm betting on." They finished cleaning in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. The kind that came from understanding rather than distance. The weeks passed. Brennan rotated through different assignments, learning from officers who had survived their first battles and emerged with hard-won wisdom. He studied German tactics from captured documents, memorizing the patterns that made their ambushes so effective. He practiced calling artillery fire, coordinating with infantry, using terrain for cover instead of charging blindly forward. And slowly, Patterson's plan became clear. This was not punishment. This was education, the kind that could not be taught in classrooms, that required humiliation and failure, and the grinding away of arrogance until only competence remained. On a Tuesday morning in early March, Brennan was summoned to Patterson's tent. The general sat behind his field desk, looking older than his 57 years, the weight of command visible in every line of his face. "Sit down, Mike." The use of his first name was new. Brennan sat, wondering if this was another lesson or something else. Patterson pushed a folder across the desk. "Intelligence reports. German forces are consolidating around Guettar. We're planning a defensive operation, fortified positions in the passes. Let them come to us for once." He leaned back in his chair. "I'm giving you back C Company. Your old crew, Kowalski, Washington, Chen. They've been training separately, but they're ready to come back together. Question is, are you?" Brennan thought about everything he had learned, all the failures and lessons and moments of hard-won understanding. He thought about Hayes and Washington and all the men who had tried to teach him what command really meant. "I don't know, sir. I hope so." Patterson's expression softened slightly. "That's the right answer. If you'd said yes, I'd know you hadn't learned anything. Certainty gets men killed. Doubt keeps them alive. as long as you don't let it paralyze you. He opened another folder, this one containing personnel files. Your crew has changed. Kowalski's been sober for 3 weeks straight. First time in 5 years, according to his record. Washington's become the best mechanic in the division. And Chen earned a battlefield promotion to sergeant for actions at Kasserine that didn't make it into your report. What actions? Patterson slid a paper across the desk. A commendation signed by 3 different officers. When your company was retreating over the mountain, Chen stayed behind to destroy classified radio codes. Under fire. Alone. Could have been captured or killed, but he made sure the Germans didn't get intelligence that would have cost more American lives. Brennan read the commendation, seeing Bobby Chen in a new light. Not Sarah's little brother, not a scared kid loading shells. A soldier who had made a hard choice under pressure and followed through. I didn't know. You were busy being relieved of command. Patterson's tone carried no judgment, just statement of fact. The point is, your crew grew while you were gone. They're not the same men you lost at Sidi Bouzid, and you're not the same officer. The question is whether you can lead them now. Brennan met his eyes. I'll do my best, sir. Your best got 50 men killed. I need better than your best. I need you to be the officer your father would have been if he'd survived Belleau Wood. Can you be that? The challenge hung in the air. Brennan thought about his father's letter, about the Purple Heart that sat in his footlocker, about all the weight of legacy and expectation. Then he thought about something else, about Washington's son named Michael, about Kowalski staying sober, about Chen destroying codes alone on a mountainside, about men who deserved a commander who saw them as more than pieces on a board. I can try, sir, that's all I can promise. Patterson stood, extending his hand. Then report to the motor pool at 0600 tomorrow. Your crew is waiting. And Mike, one more thing. Sir, don't thank me for giving you another chance. Thank your men. They're the ones who asked for you back. Said they'd rather have an officer who learned from failure than one who'd never failed. That's the highest praise a commander can receive. The words followed Brennan out of the tent, across the compound, through a sleepless night. His crew had asked for him, after everything, after the failures and the deaths and the relief of command. They wanted him back. The weight of that trust was heavier than any medal. Dawn broke cold and clear. Brennan arrived at the motor pool to find his crew waiting beside a new Sherman, this one fresh from the factory in Detroit, armor clean and unmarked by combat. Washington stood beside the driver's hatch. Kowalski sat on the hull, cleaning the main gun. Chen checked ammunition in the turret. They looked up as he approached. No one saluted. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, Kowalski broke the silence. Captain, heard you're back in command. Brennan climbed up onto the hull, standing where he could see all 3 of them. Before we go any further, I need to say something. I failed you at Faid Pass and Sidi Bouzid. I was arrogant and stupid, and I got good men killed. You have every right to refuse to serve under me again. Washington crossed his arms. We know all that, sir. That's not why we're here. Then why? Chen answered, his voice stronger than Brennan remembered. Because you learned. Because you spent 6 weeks watching other officers and working in the motor pool and studying tactics. Because when Patterson asked if we wanted you back, we said yes. Kowalski nodded. We've all failed, Captain. I was drunk at Faid Pass. My shooting was off. Men died because I was too busy drowning my demons to do my job properly. Difference is you owned your failure. That's more than most officers do. Washington stepped forward. Sir, my son is named Michael because I believe in the idea of what you could be, not what you were. And I'm betting my life that you've become that man. Don't make me regret it. The trust they offered was almost too much to bear. Brennan felt the weight of it pressing down, threatening to crush him. But he also felt something else. Determination. The absolute certainty that he would not fail these men again. Could not. All right, then let's talk about how we're going to fight differently. Because I'm not the same officer I was, and we're not going to use the same tactics. From now on, this crew works as a team. I give orders, but I listen first. Understood? Understood, sir. Good. Now what do we call this beast? They looked at the unmarked hull, the fresh paint, the machine that would either carry them to victory or become their tomb. Chen spoke first. Defiant. Because we don't quit, no matter what. The others nodded. Brennan felt something shift in his chest, a settling of purpose. He climbed into the commander's hatch. feeling the familiar confines of the turret, the smell of oil and metal and ammunition. This was home now, the steel box and these three men. Everything else was secondary. Washington started the engine. The Ford GAA roared to life, 450 horses of Detroit iron. Kowalski traversed the turret, checking the gun's movement. Chen loaded a practice round, the breech closing with a solid clunk. They drove out to the training range and spent the next 12 hours working together, rebuilding the coordination that combat had shattered. Fire and maneuver, hold down positions, mutual support with other tanks. All the tactics Brennan had learned from Hayes and the other officers, adapted and refined until they became instinct. By evening, they moved like the crew Brennan had watched in Hayes's tank. Not perfect, but competent. Not fearless, but determined. And most importantly, they trusted each other. Not the blind trust of the inexperienced, but the hard-won trust of men who had survived hell together and were willing to face it again. That night, gathered around a small fire outside the barracks, they talked. Not about tactics or orders, but about life, about who they were beyond the ranks and the roles. Kowalski spoke about the factory accident that had driven him to drink, about the man who had died because Kowalski had been careless, about how he had run away to the army rather than face the consequences. 3 weeks sober now, and every day was a battle against the flask he no longer carried, but still felt in his pocket like a phantom limb. Washington talked about growing up in Georgia, about watching his father die for talking back to a white overseer, about how he had learned to swallow rage and smile and survive, about how his wife Louise was the strongest person he knew, raising their son alone while he fought a war for a country that did not believe he was fully human. Chen revealed what Brennan had not known, about his family's internment, about letters that came from behind barbed wire, about parents who told him to serve with honor even while America imprisoned them for looking like the enemy, about his sister Sarah, who worked in a restaurant and dreamed of a future where being Chinese did not mean being suspect. The mention of Sarah's name made Brennan's chest tight. He had not told them about his relationship with her, about the promises made and the futures imagined that could never be. But Chen looked at him with knowing eyes, and Brennan realized the secret had never been secret at all. She told me about you two. Before I shipped out, Brennan did not know what to say. The words stuck in his throat, a confession and an apology all tangled together. Chen continued, "She made me promise to watch out for you. Said you were a good man who thought too much with his head and not enough with his heart. Guess she was right. I promised her I'd keep you safe. I failed." Chen shook his head. "No, sir. You kept me alive. Through Faid and Sidi Bou Zid and Kasserine, we're both still here. That's what matters. And when we get home, you're going to face her and tell her you did your best. That's all anyone can ask." The conversation drifted to quieter topics, to memories of home and dreams of futures they might not live to see. Brennan listened more than he spoke, learning about the men whose lives he held in his hands, understanding for the first time that command meant more than giving orders. It meant carrying the weight of their hopes and fears and the trust they placed in his judgment. When the fire burned down to embers, they returned to the barracks. Brennan lay on his bunk, thinking about everything that had changed. He was not the same man who had stepped off the transport ship in November. That man had been arrogant and certain and convinced that technology and training could overcome any obstacle. This man knew better, knew that war was chaos and chance, and that the best plans disintegrated under fire, knew that leadership meant listening to men who knew more than you did, knew that every decision carried consequences measured in lives. The Purple Heart lay in his footlocker, wrapped in his father's letter. Brennan took them both out, holding the medal up to the dim light. His father had earned this at Belleau Wood by leading men into hell and bringing some of them back. Brennan had not earned it yet, might never earn it, but he could try, could be the commander these men deserved, even if he fell short of the commander his father had been. He pinned the medal to his uniform and wrote a letter he would never send, words meant for his father's ghost and his own conscience. "I understand now what you were trying to tell me. Command is not about being right, it's about being responsible for the men who trust you, for the decisions that haunt you, for the ones who don't come home. I've failed, but I'm still here, still trying, still learning. I hope that's enough. I hope you would be proud, even though I have so far to go." The weeks blurred together, training during the day, planning at night, building the kind of crew cohesion that could only come from shared hardship and mutual respect. Patterson briefed them on the coming battle at El Guettar, showed them maps of the defensive positions, explained how this time the Americans would have the advantage of terrain and preparation. Intelligence reported German forces massing for a final push, trying to break through the American lines and open an escape route to the coast. 75 panzers, including elements from units that had massacred the Americans at Sidi Bouzid, among them a Panzer IV with distinctive white markings on the turret, number 712. The intelligence officer pointed to a grainy photograph. This is Hauptmann Klaus Richter's command tank. He led the attack at Sidi Bouzid. His unit is credited with destroying at least 60 American tanks in the last 3 months. Brennan studied the photograph, memorizing the markings, the shape, the details that would let him identify this particular enemy in the chaos of combat. This was the tank that had killed his men. The commander who had written tactical analyses that Brennan had read in captured documents, professional assessments that showed both respect for American courage and contempt for American tactics. Patterson noticed his focus. Personal, Captain? Brennan shook his head. Professional, sir. I want to beat him. Fairly. Show him we learned. Patterson's expression was unreadable. Good. Because he's coming straight at your sector, and this time we're ready. The briefing continued. Overlapping fields of fire, pre-positioned artillery, tank destroyers in hull-down positions. All the lessons learned from the defeats distilled into a defensive plan that turned American weaknesses into strengths. C Company drew positions on the northern ridge overlooking the main pass. They would be the anvil against which the German attack would break. 40 tanks and tank destroyers dug into positions that made them almost invisible from below, with clear fields of fire covering the approaches. On March 22nd, they moved into position. The crew worked through the night, using shovels and explosives to create hull-down fighting positions that exposed only the turret, protecting the vulnerable hull. It was exhausting work, digging into rocky soil, but it was also purposeful. Every shovelful of earth was protection. Every stone placed was a life potentially saved. By dawn, Defiant sat in a position that would have made Hayes proud. Invisible from the valley below with a clear view of the approach routes, hull protected by earth and stone. Chen stacked ammunition within easy reach. Kowalski bore-sighted the gun, checking elevation and traverse. Washington tested the engine, making sure they could reposition quickly if needed. Brennan stood in the commander's hatch, watching the sun rise over the valley, and felt something he had not felt since before Faid Pass. Not confidence, something harder and more valuable. Readiness. That evening, as the crew ran final checks, a messenger arrived with an intelligence update. Scouts had spotted the German force moving into assembly positions. Among the identified vehicles, Panzer 712, Richter's command tank. They would attack at dawn. Brennan gathered his crew around the tank. Tomorrow we face the same enemy that beat us at Sidi Bouzid. Same panzers, same tactics, probably some of the same commanders. But we're different. We learned, we trained, we're ready. Kowalski nodded. We hold the ground this time. They come to us. Washington added his agreement. And we've got good positions, good fields of fire. Plus, Captain actually listens to us now. The comment drew quiet laughter, breaking the tension. Chen spoke last, his voice steady. For Goldman, for all the others, we don't retreat this time. Brennan looked at each of them in turn. These men who had every reason to doubt him and had chosen trust instead. We fight smart, we fight together, and we all go home. That's the mission. They spent the night taking turns on watch, sleeping in shifts, writing letters they hoped would never need to be sent. Brennan wrote to Rachel Goldman, a letter he had been composing in his mind for weeks, trying to find words that would honor her husband's memory without lying about how he had died. He wrote to his mother, simple words about being safe and thinking of home. And he wrote to Sarah Chen, a letter that said everything he had been too afraid to say before about love and regret and hope for a future that might never come. The letters went into his pack, to be sent if he did not survive. Then he checked his equipment one more time, cleaned his pistol, reviewed the battle plan until he could recite it in his sleep. Around midnight, Chen climbed up to the turret where Brennan sat on watch. The kid was 20 years old but looked older now, the boyishness burned away by 3 months of combat. Captain, can I ask you something? Always. Do you think we're going to win tomorrow? Brennan considered the question. weighing honesty against reassurance. I think we're going to fight, and I think we've got a better chance than we did at Sidi Bouzid. Beyond that, I don't know, but I know I'd rather face it with this crew than any other in the army. Chen nodded slowly. Sarah asked me to watch out for you, but I think you've been watching out for me this whole time. Thank you for that. The gratitude hit harder than expected. Brennan had spent so much time feeling like a failure that the idea someone might actually appreciate his leadership felt foreign. Bobby, you've become a good soldier. Better than good. Your sister would be proud. She's proud of both of us. She told me in her last letter, said she knows we're looking after each other. The words hung in the cold night air, carrying weight beyond their simple meaning. Brennan thought about Sarah, about promises and love, and all the complications of trying to build something real in the middle of a war that made futures uncertain. When this is over, when we get home, I'm going to marry her, if she'll have me. Chen smiled, the first genuine smile Brennan had seen from him in weeks. She will. She told me that too. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching stars wheel overhead, listening to the distant rumble of artillery from other sectors. Tomorrow would bring fire and death and the test of everything they had learned. But tonight there was peace, and the knowledge that whatever came, they would face it together. At 0500, the Germans came. The sound reached them before the sight, a deep rumble that shook the ground, the combined roar of 75 Panzer engines echoing through the valley. Brennan pressed his face to the periscope, watching the darkness below resolve into shapes, into vehicles, into the enemy that had haunted his nightmares for 3 months. They advanced slowly, 5 kilometers per hour, a solid wedge of steel grinding forward with inexorable purpose. No fancy maneuvers, no attempt at surprise. Just raw power and determination, trying to bludgeon through American lines by sheer force. Brennan keyed the company radio. All units, hold fire until my command. Let them come. Let them get close. The waiting was agony. Every instinct screamed to shoot, to engage while the range was long, to do something other than watch the enemy approach. But Brennan had learned patience, had learned that sometimes the hardest part of command was doing nothing. At 1,500 meters, he could make out individual tanks. At 1,200, he could see commanders in hatches. At 1,000 meters, with the panzers fully committed to the valley floor, trapped by terrain they could not avoid, he gave the order. All units, fire at will, hit them hard. 40 American guns opened up simultaneously. The valley erupted in thunder and flame. German tanks staggered under the impact, some stopping dead as penetrating shots found critical components, others continuing to advance even as smoke poured from engine decks. Kowalski's first shot was perfect, a hit on a Panzer IV at 900 meters that penetrated the turret side and set off the ammunition. The German tank exploded from the inside, turret lifting on a pillar of flame before crashing back down onto a hull that would never move again. Chen's hands were steady, loading with mechanical precision. Up, ready! Kowalski fired again. Another hit, another kill. The rhythm was hypnotic, deadly, efficient. This was what they had trained for. This was why they had spent weeks practicing until the movements became instinct. Washington kept them positioned perfectly, the engine purring, ready to move if enemy fire got too close. But the hold-down position protected them, giving the Germans no clear shot at Defiant's vulnerable sides or rear. The battle became a blur of smoke and noise and target identification. Brennan called out threats, prioritized targets, coordinated with adjacent units. The radio filled with traffic, but it was organized chaos this time, not the panicked screaming of Faid Pass. Everyone knew their role. Everyone executed. At 1100 hours, Brennan spotted it, a Panzer IV with white markings advancing through the smoke. 712, Richter's tank pushing forward even as the German attack stalled around him. Wham. Target, Panzer IV, white turret markings, 1100 meters. That's Richter. I want him. Kowalski's voice was calm, identified, tracking. The two tanks dueled across the valley, professional respect mixed with lethal intent. Kowalski's first shot hit the Glacier's plate but deflected, the angle too shallow for penetration. Richter's return fire was equally accurate, hitting the dirt berm in front of Defiant and showering them with stones. Washington repositioned without being told, giving Kowalski a better angle. Chen loaded armor-piercing, then high-explosive, ready for whatever the situation demanded. Kowalski's second shot caught Panzer 712 in the turret ring, That vulnerable gap between turret and hull where no amount of armor could fully protect. The shell did not penetrate, but it jammed the traverse mechanism, leaving Richter's gun pointing away from them, useless. Brennan could have ordered the kill shot, could have ended it there, but he saw German crew members bailing out, saw Richter himself emerge from the hatch, uniform smoking, and made a different choice. Koch's gun, suppress only, let the infantry take them prisoner. Washington and Chen both looked at him in surprise. Kowalski's hands stilled on the main gun controls. Sir, he's done. Tank's mission killed. We don't waste ammunition on targets that can't fight back. And Richter's a professional soldier. He deserves professional courtesy. Fire the Kochs. The 30 caliber machine gun rattled, stitching dirt around the German crew, forcing them down but not killing them. American infantry moved in, taking prisoners, and Richter surrendered with military precision, standing at attention even in defeat. Brennan watched through the periscope as Richter was led away and felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just the grim recognition that they had both been tools of forces larger than themselves, trying to survive and do their duty in a war that would grind them both to dust if given the chance. The battle raged for 12 more hours. By evening, the German attack had broken, 31 panzers destroyed, 21 American tanks and tank destroyers lost. Victory, but not the clean kind, never the clean kind. Brennan climbed out of Defiant on shaking legs, his ears ringing from hours of gunfire, his body aching from the constant vibration and stress. Around him, the valley was a graveyard of burning vehicles and the scattered detritus of battle. But his crew was alive, all of them. That was victory enough. Patterson arrived an hour later, touring the positions, assessing damage, congratulating crews. When he reached Defiant, he looked at Brennan for a long moment before speaking. You held. Against a force that should have broken you, you held. We held together, sir. The crew made it happen. Patterson nodded slowly. That's what I wanted to hear. Not taking credit, giving it. He pulled something from his pocket. Your father's Purple Heart. I think you've earned the right to wear it now. Brennan took the medal, feeling the weight of legacy and loss, and earned respect. But when he pinned it to his uniform, it was not for his father's memory. It was for the crew that had trusted him to lead them through hell and back. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. Thank them. And Mike, one more thing. You're promoted to major. Battalion command. We need officers who learn the hard way. The easy learners don't survive long enough to matter. The words followed Brennan through the evening, through the exhausted celebrations, through the grim work of recovering the dead and treating the wounded. He found his crew gathered around Defiant, cleaning weapons and checking damage, and sat with them as the sun set over a battlefield they had held. We did it. We held the line. Kowalski grinned, the first real smile Brennan had seen from him in months. Damn right we did, and I stayed sober the whole time. 6 hours of combat, and I didn't even think about the flask. Washington clapped him on the shoulder. That's because you were too busy being the best gunner in the division. Chen added his voice. We all were. The best crew. That's what matters. Brennan looked at each of them, these men who had taught him more about command than any classroom ever could, and felt something settle in his chest. Not peace. There would never be peace, not with the memories they all carried, but purpose, direction, the knowledge that they had become what they needed to be. Tomorrow, they would write letters, would bury the dead, would prepare for the next battle. But tonight they could rest, could be proud, could know that they had learned the lessons written in blood and fire and had survived to teach them to others. The war was far from over. Tunisia would fall, then Sicily, then Italy, then France, then Germany itself. Years of fighting still ahead, but they would face it together, steel forged in the fire of defeat, tempered by the hammer of experience, honed to an edge that would carry them through whatever came next. That was enough. For tonight it was enough. The stars over El Guettar burned cold and distant, indifferent to the men who would die when dawn came. Major Michael Brennan sat in the commander's hatch of Defiant, watching the valley below where German armor would soon advance, and thought about all the moments that had led him here. Faid Pass, Sidi Bou Zid, Kasserine. Each defeat a lesson written in blood, each failure a step toward this moment when everything would be tested. Behind him, the northern ridge bristled with American armor. 40 tanks and tank destroyers dug into positions that made them nearly invisible. each one commanding overlapping fields of fire across the killing ground below. This was not the reckless charge of Sidi Bouzid. This was professional warfare, the kind his father might have recognized from the trenches of France. Let the enemy come. Make them pay for every meter. Chen moved quietly in the loader's position, arranging shells for maximum efficiency. 23 rounds of armor-piercing, 8 high-explosive, 4 white phosphorus for smoke, each one checked and rechecked, ready for the hell that morning would bring. Kowalski sat at the gunner's station, hands steady on the controls. 3 weeks sober and more focused than Brennan had ever seen him. The flask was gone, replaced by something harder. Purpose, the knowledge that today would prove whether the lessons learned in defeat could forge victory. Washington rested in the driver's seat, eyes closed but not sleeping, running through mental checklists of escape routes and emergency procedures. His hands, scarred from motor pool work, lay ready on the controls. Those hands had built the engine that would keep them alive, had saved them at Faid Pass when Brennan had frozen, would save them again if given the chance. The radio crackled with traffic from other positions, last-minute adjustments, status reports. The quiet professionalism of men who knew what was coming and were ready to face it. Patterson's voice cut through the chatter. All units. Intelligence confirms German attack at dawn. 75 panzers, including Richter's group from Sidi Bouzid. They're desperate. They're dangerous. But we're ready. Hold your positions. Trust your training. Make them pay for every inch. Patterson out. The words settled over the ridge like a benediction. Brennan keyed his crew intercom. You all heard the general. This is what we trained for, what we learned from all those failures. Today we show them we're not the same army they beat 3 months ago. Kowalski's voice was steady. We hold, sir, no retreat. Washington added his agreement, engines purring like a kitten. We can move or stay as needed. Your call, Major. Chen spoke last, his voice carrying a confidence that would have been impossible back in November. Ammunition ready. I won't let you down. Brennan felt something shift in his chest. Not fear, though fear was present. Not confidence, which was just arrogance waiting to fail. Something else. Resolve. The absolute certainty that whatever happened, they would face it together. The night crawled toward dawn. Brennan tried to sleep but couldn't, his mind churning through scenarios and contingencies. At 0300, he climbed down from the tank and walked the ridgeline, checking positions, talking quietly with other commanders, reinforcing the plan one last time. Major Hayes found him near 2nd Platoon's positions. His face was invisible in the darkness, just a voice in the glow of a cigarette. You ready, Brennan? As ready as anyone can be for this. Hayes took a long drag, the ember flaring bright. I watched you train these past weeks, saw you change from the officer who got his men killed to the commander who might keep them alive. That's rare. Most men never make that transition. They die still believing their own mythology. I had good teachers. You had failure. That's the only teacher that matters. Hayes crushed out the cigarette. You're going to lose men today. Even with good tactics and good positions, the math of combat means some won't make it home. Can you live with that? The question hung in the cold air. Brennan thought about Goldman, about all the names on the casualty list, about his father carrying gas-scarred lungs and memories of men who died following his orders. I'll have to. The alternative is giving up, and that would make their deaths meaningless. Hayes clapped him on the shoulder. Good answer. Now get back to your crew. They need to see you confident, even if you're terrified inside. The walk back to Defiant felt longer than it should have. Brennan climbed into the commander's hatch and found his crew awake, waiting. No words passed between them. None were needed. They had become what they needed to be. The only question was whether it would be enough. At 0430, the world changed. A sound rose from the valley, a deep mechanical growl that shook the earth and filled the air with dread. 75 Panzer engines starting simultaneously, a chorus of German steel preparing to advance. The sound grew louder, closer, impossible to ignore or escape. Brennan pressed his face to the periscope. Darkness still covered the valley floor, but vehicle silhouettes were visible against the slightly lighter sky. Panzers forming up in assault formation, preparing for the attack that would either break through American lines or shatter against them. All units, weapons tight until my command. Let them commit. Let them get close enough to hurt. The waiting was agony. Every instinct screamed to fire, to engage at maximum range, to do something rather than watch death approach on steel treads. But Brennan had learned patience, had learned that discipline won battles more surely than aggression. Dawn broke slowly, light creeping across the desert like something reluctant, revealing the full scale of the German force. 75 panzers in 3 waves, advancing at walking pace, a solid wall of armor that looked unstoppable. At the center of the formation, a Panzer IV with distinctive white markings on the turret. 712, Richter's tank, leading from the front the way professional soldiers always did. 1,500 meters. Brennan's mouth was dry, his hands slick with sweat despite the morning cold. The panzers kept coming, grinding forward with mechanical inevitability. 1,200 meters. He could see individual tanks now, could identify Panzer IVs from the older Mark IIIs, could pick out command vehicles by their extra antennas. 1,000 meters. The Germans were fully committed now, trapped in the valley by terrain that channeled them into killing zones, unable to deploy or maneuver without exposing flanks to positions on the ridges. All units, fire at will, hit them hard. 40 American guns erupted simultaneously. The valley exploded in thunder and flame, and the screaming sound of steel penetrating steel. German tanks staggered under the impact. Some stopped dead, smoke pouring from hatches. Others continued forward even as internal fires consumed their crews. Kowalski's first shot was textbook perfect. A Panzer III at 900 meters, the shell punching through the turret face and detonating inside. The German tank lurched to a stop, hatches flying open, crew members bailing into a hell of machine gun fire and shell fragments. Up. Chen's voice was mechanical, automatic, the product of endless training. Ready. Kowalski fired again. Another hit. Another kill. The rhythm was hypnotic, deadly, professional. This was what they had become. Not heroes, not glory seekers, just soldiers doing a job that needed doing. Washington kept them positioned perfectly, making micro-adjustments that kept the hull protected behind the earthen berm while the turret had clear fields of fire. His hands moved across the controls with the confidence of a man who understood his machine at a level deeper than training could teach. The battle developed in stages. The first wave of German armor tried to push through, believing momentum and heavy armor would carry them past American positions. They died by the dozen, panzers burning where they stopped, blocking routes for vehicles behind them. The second wave tried to maneuver, seeking cover in wadis and behind rises. But the American positions had been chosen specifically to deny such cover. Tanks that broke formation to find safety found only different angles of death. At 0700, 2 hours into the battle, the German attack began to fracture. Radio intercepts revealed confusion in their command structure, uncertainty about whether to press forward or withdraw. Some units continued to advance. Others sought defensive positions. The cohesion that made armor effective began to dissolve. But Panzer 712 kept coming. Richter advanced through smoke and fire, his tank weaving between burning wrecks, still pushing toward the American lines with single-minded determination. It was either courage or desperation, probably both. Kowalski tracked the German commander. "Sir, I have Richter, 800 meters, clean shot." "Not yet. Let him get closer. I want to see what he does." The Panzer IV advanced to 600 meters before stopping in a hull-down position behind a destroyed Sherman from an earlier battle. Richter was learning, adapting, using American losses as cover. Professional to the end. The duel began at 0730. 2 commanders, 2 crews, fighting with everything they had learned from months of combat. Kowalski's first shot hit the wrecked Sherman that Richter sheltered behind, the impact showering the German tank with fragments but causing no damage. Richter's return fire was equally accurate, a shot that struck the berm in front of Defiant and threw dirt over the turret. If they had been exposed, that shot would have killed them all. Washington repositioned without being told, moving them 15 meters left to a secondary position they had prepared the night before. The movement gave Kowalski a better angle, a shot at Panzer 712's exposed side. Target acquired, firing. The 75mm gun roared. The shell crossed 600 meters in less than a second, striking Panzer 712 exactly where the turret met the hull. The most vulnerable point on any tank, the place where no amount of armor could fully protect the mechanisms that let the turret traverse. The impact was catastrophic. Not a penetration exactly, but a mechanical kill. The turret ring jammed, freezing Richter's gun in place, pointing away from Defiant, useless for engaging threats. Smoke began to pour from the engine compartment. Something critical had broken. Through his periscope, Brennan watched the German crew bail out. 4 men emerging from hatches, uniforms smoking, faces black with soot. Richter himself was last, standing on the hull for just a moment, looking up at the ridge where his killer waited. There was no triumph in the moment, no sense of victory, just 2 professionals who had survived when they should have died, separated by 600 meters in the accidents of birth that had made them enemies. "Sir, permission to finish them." Chen's voice carried an edge Brennan had never heard before. For Goldman, for all of them. Brennan understood the impulse, the need for revenge, for evening the score, for making the enemy pay in blood for every American who had died screaming in a burning tank. But he also understood something else, something his father had tried to teach him in that letter written so many years ago. Negative. Coke's gun only. Suppress, don't kill. Infantry will take them prisoner. The decision hung in the air. Brennan could feel his crew's confusion, their need to strike back at the men who had caused so much pain. But command meant making hard choices, meant choosing the kind of war you wanted to fight. Kowalski's voice was tight. "Sir, they massacred us at Sidi Bou Zid, 45 tanks. They didn't show mercy." "I know, Danny, but we're not them. And Richter's a soldier, not a war criminal. He deserves professional courtesy." Fire the Cokes. The 30 caliber machine gun rattled, stitching dirt around the German crew, forcing them to take cover but not killing them. Within minutes, American infantry moved in, taking prisoners at gunpoint. Richter surrendered with military precision, standing at attention, even in defeat, saluting the lieutenant who accepted his pistol. Brennan watched through the periscope as Richter was led away and felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, not triumph, just the grim knowledge that they had both been tools of larger forces, trying to survive and do their duty in a war that would grind them both to nothing if given the chance. The battle raged on. German forces, leaderless without Richter, began a fighting withdrawal. American guns pursued them, extracting a toll for every meter of retreat. By noon, the attack had broken completely. Panzers withdrew in disorder, leaving 31 burning wrecks scattered across the valley. But victory had its price. 21 American tanks and tank destroyers destroyed, crews killed or wounded. Good men who would never go home, never see their families, never know anything beyond the moment when German steel found them. Brennan climbed out of Defiant on shaking legs, his body aching from 12 hours of constant tension. Around him, other crews emerged from their positions, faces hollow with exhaustion, hands trembling from adrenaline crash. Kowalski climbed down and immediately lit a cigarette, his hands steady despite everything. "We did it, sir. We held." Washington joined them, wiping grease from his hands. "Engine ran perfect, not a single mechanical failure. She brought us through." Chen was the last out, moving slowly, checking ammunition counts out of habit even though the battle was over. "We used 19 AP rounds, 4 HE, no white phosphorus. Confirmed 4 kills, 3 probable." The statistics felt meaningless. Numbers on a report that would never capture the reality of what they had just survived. But they were also proof. Evidence that training and discipline and hard-won experience could overcome the advantages of enemy armor and tactics. Patterson arrived an hour later, his command half-track rolling along the ridgeline, stopping at each position to assess damage and congratulate crews. When he reached Defiant, he climbed down and stood looking at Brennan for a long moment. "You held. Against everything Rommel taught them, everything they learned in 3 years of combat, you held." "We held together, sir. Every crew on this ridge. This wasn't one tank or one commander. This was the whole damn army finally learning how to fight." Patterson's expression softened slightly. "That's leadership, Mike, not taking credit. Recognizing that victory belongs to everyone who bled for it." He pulled an envelope from his jacket. "Your promotion to major is confirmed. Battalion command effective immediately. We need officers who learn the hard lessons and live to apply them." The weight of responsibility settled onto Brennan's shoulders. More tanks, more crews, more lives depending on his judgment. The thought was almost overwhelming. "Thank you, sir. I'll do my best. Your best got 50 men killed back in February." Patterson's tone was not cruel, just factual. "But your best also just held this ridge against a force that should have broken you. The difference is 3 months of learning. Don't forget those lessons. Don't let success make you arrogant again. The warning was clear. Command required constant vigilance, constant questioning, constant awareness that one moment of overconfidence could undo everything they had built. Brennan saluted. Understood, sir, I won't forget. Patterson returned the salute and moved on to the next position. Brennan stood watching him go, feeling the weight of the Purple Heart on his chest. His father's medal that he had finally earned through failure and redemption. That evening, as the sun set over the valley of burning tanks, Brennan gathered his crew around Defiant. They had cleaned weapons, checked equipment, done all the mechanical tasks that filled the hours after battle. Now they sat in exhausted silence, too tired to celebrate, too wired to sleep. Danny, you were perfect today. Every shot counted. Kowalski shrugged. 3 weeks sober helps. Hands don't shake when you're not poisoning yourself with whiskey. James, that driving saved us a dozen times. Every repositioning was exactly right. Washington smiled slightly. Just doing what the machine needed. She and I understand each other now. Bobby, your loading was flawless. Professional as any veteran in the division. Chen ducked his head, uncomfortable with praise. Just did my job, sir, for Goldman, for everyone we lost. The mention of Goldman brought silence. 3 months dead now, but still present in everything they did. Still the ghost that reminded them why they fought, why they trained, why they pushed themselves beyond exhaustion. Brennan pulled out the letters he had written the night before. The ones meant to be sent if he died. He looked at them for a long moment, then crumpled them up. There would be time to write new ones, time to tell the people back home that they had survived another day, time to promise futures that might actually come true. Tomorrow we bury the dead. Day after we start preparing for the next operation. Sicily probably, then Italy, then France. This war isn't over. But today we won. Today we proved we learned. That's worth something. The crew nodded, each man lost in his own thoughts. They had become something rare in war. Not heroes, not glory hounds, just professionals who understood their craft and executed it with deadly precision. That was enough. That was everything. 2 days later, Brennan received an unusual summons. Patterson wanted him at the POW camp, something about a German officer requesting to meet the American commander who had defeated him. The request was irregular, but Patterson approved it, saying Brennan had earned the right to face his enemy as a man rather than just a target. The POW camp was a collection of tents surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by MPs who looked bored and resentful of their assignment. Brennan followed an escort to the medical tent where captured officers received treatment before being shipped to permanent facilities. Hauptmann Klaus Richter sat on a cot, his hands bandaged, his face showing burn scars that would mark him for life. He stood when Brennan entered, military courtesy overriding the pain of his injuries. They studied each other in silence. 2 men who had tried to kill each other and failed, now face to face without the buffer of distance and steel. Richter spoke first, his English nearly perfect, with just a trace of accent. You are the commander of the Sherman that destroyed my tank. I recognize the tactical style from our engagement. Brennan nodded. Captain Brennan, promoted to major 2 days ago. Richter smiled slightly, the expression pulling at burned skin. Congratulations on your promotion and your victory. You fought well. Very different from Sidi Bouzid. We learned. Paid tuition and blood, but we learned. The best education, though the most expensive. Richter gestured to another cot. Please sit. I asked to meet you because I wanted to understand the man who beat me. In 3 years of combat, I have rarely been outfought. You managed it. Brennan sat, studying the German officer. Richter was 32, only 3 years older than himself, but worn by combat in ways that made him seem ancient. There was no hatred in his eyes, no anger, just professional curiosity in the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting too long. I read your tactical diary, the one we captured at Sidi Bouzid. You wrote that American crews were brave, but commanders were foolish. Richter nodded. That was accurate at the time. You charged blindly into positions any experienced officer that would have recognized as traps. It was almost sad watching such courage wasted. And now I think American commanders learned faster than anyone expected. You adapted, changed tactics, used terrain properly. That is the mark of professional soldiers. He paused, something flickering across his face. May I ask you something personal? Go ahead. When you disabled my tank, when my crew and I were exposed, you could have killed us easily. Why did you not? Brennan thought about the question, about all the reasons he could give. Tactical considerations, ammunition conservation, professional courtesy. But he settled on the truth. Because I read the letter your wife sent, the one intelligence intercepted, about your son being born, about her wanting you to come home. Richter's face went very still. You know about Klaus Jr.? Born April 2nd, healthy, your wife is safe. Red Cross confirmed it. The information hit the German officer like a physical blow. He sat down heavily, hands shaking, tears cutting tracks through the soot and grime still marking his face. I did not know. We had no communication. I thought perhaps the birth was difficult. Perhaps she did not survive. She survived, your son survived, and now you'll survive to see them when this war ends. Richter wept openly, no shame in the tears, no attempt to hide the emotion. Brennan sat quietly, giving the man space to process the news that his family was whole, that he had not been fighting for nothing. After a long moment, Richter composed himself. Thank you for this gift, for the information, and for the mercy that made it possible. He met Brennan's eyes. You could have killed me, should have killed me by the mathematics of war, but you chose humanity. That is rare. My father fought in the last war. Belleau Wood. He told me that steel breaks, but men endure. I chose men. Your father was wise. Mine fought at the Somme. He died from wounds in 1931, 13 years after the war ended, but it killed him just the same. We fight our father's war again, you and I. The observation carried weight beyond its simple words. They were both children of the Great War, both raised by men, scarred by trenches in Gem and the mechanized slaughter of industrial warfare. Both trying to survive a conflict that seemed determined to repeat all the same mistakes. After this war, if we both survive, perhaps we can meet again, as men, not soldiers. Brennan considered it, the idea of corresponding with a former enemy, of building something beyond the enmity that politics demanded. It seemed impossible. But then, so had surviving Guettar. I would like that. To understand the man I fought rather than just the enemy I faced. They shook hands carefully, Richter wincing at the pressure on his burns. The MP escort indicated time was up. Brennan stood preparing to leave, then turned back. Hauptmann, one more thing. You're a good soldier. You did your duty with honor. Whatever happens to Germany, whatever comes after this war ends, you can hold your head up. You fought well. Richter nodded slowly. As did you, Major. Your father would be proud. The words followed Brennan out of the tent, across the compound, back to his own lines. His father would be proud. 3 months ago, that would have seemed impossible. But now, carrying the weight of hard-won experience and the respect of men who had every reason to doubt him, perhaps it was true. May 13th, 1943. The German forces in Tunisia surrendered. 250,000 men laid down their arms, the largest Axis capitulation of the war to that point. The North African campaign was over. The Americans had learned to fight, paying tuition in blood and steel, earning their place as professional soldiers rather than enthusiastic amateurs. Brennan stood with his crew at the surrender ceremony, watching endless columns of German soldiers march into captivity. Among them, he spotted Richter still bearing himself with military pride despite the bandages and the burn scars. Their eyes met across the distance. Richter nodded once, a gesture of respect between professionals. Brennan returned it. That evening, Patterson called a meeting of all battalion and company commanders. The tent was crowded, filled with officers who had survived the campaign and carried the scars to prove it. Patterson stood at the front, looking older than his years, the weight of command visible in every line of his face. Gentlemen, we won. Tunisia is ours. The enemy is defeated. In 6 months, we go from embarrassment at Kasserine to triumph at Guettar. That is the American army learning to fight. He paused, letting the words settle. But we paid a price. 6,000 casualties. 300 tanks. Good men who will never go home. The tent fell silent. Every officer there knew those numbers intimately, had contributed to them, had written letters to families trying to explain the unexplainable. Patterson continued. Our next operation is Sicily, then Italy, then France, then Germany itself. Years of fighting ahead, more losses, more lessons, more prices to pay. He looked directly at Brennan. Some of you learned those lessons the hard way. You failed, got men killed, and had to rebuild yourselves into the commanders they needed. That's harder than being naturally gifted. That's more valuable. After the meeting, as officers filed out, Patterson pulled Brennan aside. I'm putting you in command of 3rd Battalion, 4 companies, 60 tanks, lives depending on your judgment. The responsibility was staggering. Brennan thought about all the ways he could fail, all the mistakes waiting to be made. Then he thought about his crew, about the trust they had placed in him, about the lessons written in blood. I won't let you down, sir. Patterson's expression was unreadable. You already made me proud, Mike. You became the officer your father would have been if he'd lived. Now go be that officer for the men who need you. The months blurred together, training for Sicily, landing in July, fighting through Italian summer heat, casualties mounting despite better tactics and better leadership. Brennan's battalion became known for aggressive competence, for achieving objectives with minimal losses, for the kind of professional warfare that won battles without unnecessary sacrifice. Washington received the Silver Star for actions at Troina in Sicily, staying with a damaged tank under artillery fire to save the crew trapped inside. The engine had seized, leaving the Sherman immobilized in the middle of a German counterattack. Washington crawled forward under machine gun fire, jury-rigged the fuel system, and got the engine running long enough for the crew to escape before the tank was destroyed by panzers. His hands were burned again, worse this time, but he refused evacuation until every man was accounted for. Kowalski earned a battlefield commission to lieutenant at the same battle, Troina, in August 1943. When the platoon commander, Lieutenant Morrison, was killed by artillery fire during a night attack, Kowalski took command without being ordered. He organized the surviving tanks, called in artillery support, and held a critical road junction for 6 hours against repeated German counterattacks. His promotion came through 3 days later, signed by Patterson himself with a note that read simply, "About damn time." Chen distinguished himself at Monte Cassino in January 1944, leading an infantry assault when tanks could not advance through the rubble of the bombed monastery. His tank destroyed, his crew scattered, Chen had grabbed a rifle and joined the infantry, pushing up the slope. He led a squad through heavy fire to capture a German machine gun position that had pinned down an entire company. For that action, he received the Silver Star and another promotion to staff sergeant. The crew that had started together at Faid Pass was being dispersed by success, each man moving to positions where their skills were needed. It was the price of victory, the cost of being good at war. But they stayed in touch, trading letters and occasional visits when duty allowed. Brennan's own promotion came after the liberation of Paris in August 1944. His battalion had been first into the city, threading through German rearguards, accepting surrender from units that no longer had the will to fight. Patterson promoted him to lieutenant colonel on the steps of the Arc de Triomphe, pinning the oak leaves to his collar while French civilians cheered and threw flowers. It should have felt triumphant. Instead, Brennan thought about all the men who had died to reach that moment, all the names added to the casualty list between Tunisia and France. 1945. Victory in Europe. The war was over, or at least this chapter of it. Brennan, now lieutenant colonel commanding a full armored regiment, stood at a cemetery in France, surrounded by white crosses that stretched to the horizon. Somewhere in this field, or one like it, his father's comrades rested. Men who had died at Belleau Wood in the Somme and all the other places where the 20th century had learned to slaughter its children with industrial efficiency. He thought about Goldman, dead 3 years now, but still present in every decision. About all the names on casualty lists, all the letters written, all the families shattered. The price of command was measured in those names, in the weight they carried forward into every day that followed. A letter arrived that summer, forwarded through Red Cross channels. German script on the envelope, careful handwriting that belonged to someone educated and precise. Richter, writing from a hospital in Munich, where he was recovering from wounds received in the last days of the war. A panzer commander to the end, he had fought in Normandy, been wounded at Caen, recovered and fought again at the Battle of the Bulge, and finally been wounded a third time in the defense of Berlin. The letter was brief. News of survival. Description of reuniting with his wife and son, Klaus Jr., who was now 2 years old, and asking about the father who had been gone most of his life. Gratitude for the mercy shown at El Guettar that had made that reunion possible. And a question, would Brennan consider corresponding? Not as enemies, but as men who had shared the experience of combat and understood its costs? Brennan wrote back, started a correspondence that would continue for decades, Two veterans trying to make sense of what they had survived, what they had done, what it all meant. The letters never resolved anything. But they helped, gave context, reminded both men that enemies were just other people caught in machinery neither could control. The years passed. Brennan returned to the United States in late 1945, received his discharge as a full colonel, and tried to build a civilian life. He married Sarah Chen in a quiet ceremony in San Francisco in 1946, defying the laws that still made interracial marriage illegal in many states. They moved to Massachusetts, where such unions were recognized, and built a life together. The nightmares never stopped. Goldman's burning tank, the screams of men dying at Faid Pass, the weight of decisions that had sent soldiers into fire. Sarah would wake him in the middle of the night, holding him while he shook, reminding him that he was home, that the war was over, that he had done his duty and survived. She died in 1975, cancer taking her slowly while Brennan watched helplessly, able to command tanks but powerless against the enemy that grew inside the woman he loved. At her funeral, Chen gave the eulogy, talking about his sister's strength, her courage, her belief that America could become the country it claimed to be. Washington attended, now 77 years old, still carrying himself with quiet dignity despite the years. Kowalski had died in 1980, his liver finally giving out from the years of drinking before he found sobriety in Tunisia. But he had lived long enough to see his niece graduate college, to receive the Medal of Honor posthumously for actions in Germany that only came to light decades later when classified records were released. The medal sat in a display case in his niece's home in Chicago, surrounded by photographs of a man who had learned that courage meant facing your demons, not drowning them. Richter's letters continued until his death in 1982, a heart attack that took him while gardening in his small plot outside Munich. His son, Klaus Jr., wrote to inform Brennan of his father's passing, adding that the old Panzer commander had spoken often of the American major who had shown mercy when he could have killed. The letter included a photograph. Richter in old age standing beside a restored Panzer IV at a museum, his hand resting on the turret ring where Brennan's shot had ended his war. 1985, 40 years after the war ended, Brennan, now 70 years old, stood at Arlington National Cemetery for the annual reunion of the 1st Armored Division. Each year, fewer men attended. Each year, more names were added to the memorial wall. Washington was there, 85 years old, in a wheelchair pushed by his son Michael. The younger man was 42 now, a successful mechanic who had inherited his father's gift for understanding machines. They embraced carefully, old men whose bodies had betrayed them, but whose friendship remained solid. Chen arrived with grandchildren in tow, pointing out the memorial wall, teaching them about duty and service and the price their grandfather had paid for their freedom. He was 62, retired from the engineering career he had built after the war, still carrying himself with the quiet dignity that had served him in combat. Kowalski's name was on the wall. Washington's hands rested on his wheelchair armrests, fingers drumming a pattern that Brennan recognized. The rhythm of loading shells in a Sherman turret, some things the body never forgot. They gathered at the wall, 3 old men surrounded by ghosts, and remembered. Not the glory, not the heroism, just the reality of what they had survived and what it had cost. Washington's son asked the question young people always asked. Grandpa, was Colonel Brennan a hero? Washington looked at Brennan, his eyes still sharp despite age. He became one. That's harder than being born one. Chen's grandchildren wanted stories. Wanted to hear about tanks and battles and dramatic victories, but the old men had learned long ago that truth was more complicated than stories. War was not glory. It was terror and boredom and brief moments of competence between long stretches of doubt. Brennan stood at the wall, running his fingers across names he recognized, men he had commanded, men who had died because of his orders or despite them or through pure random chance. The mathematics of combat made no distinction. Dead was dead. He pulled out a letter he had written that morning. Words meant for grandchildren he would never have, for generations who would grow up in a world these sacrifices had helped create. The letter talked about courage not being the absence of fear, but acting despite it. About leadership meaning listening before commanding. About technology mattering less than the men who used it. About the bonds forged in combat being stronger than blood or nationality. About war being necessary sometimes, but never glorious. about the price paid being worth it if it created a world where such prices became unnecessary. He sealed the letter and placed it at the base of the memorial, adding it to hundreds of others left by veterans and families, small testaments to loss and remembrance, and the refusal to let sacrifice be forgotten. Washington wheeled closer. "Mike, you ever regret it? The war, the command, all of it?" Brennan thought about the question, about the nightmares that still came 40 years later, about the names he carried, about Goldman and Kowalski and all the others who had not made it home. Every day, but not the men I served with, not what we built together. That was real. That mattered. Chen joined them at the wall. "You know what Sarah told me before she died? She said you gave her brother back better than he left, that you made him a man worth being proud of." The words hit harder than expected. Sarah had been gone 10 years, but the loss still felt fresh, a wound that had never properly healed. "I tried to be worthy of her faith." "You were. That's all anyone can do." They stood together in silence. 3 old men at a wall of names, survivors of a war that had ended 4 decades earlier but never really left them. The younger generations milled around, taking photographs, treating it like history. But for the old men, it was still present, still real, still the defining experience of their lives. As the sun set, Brennan saluted the wall one final time. The gesture was stiff, his shoulder protesting the movement, but he held it until every name had been honored. Then he turned away, leaning on his cane, and walked slowly toward the parking lot where his nephew waited. Behind him, the memorial wall stood silent, bronze and stone, and the accumulated weight of sacrifice. The tanks they had fought in were scrap metal now, melted down and recycled into bridges and buildings and the infrastructure of peace. But the bonds they had forged remained. The lessons they had learned persisted. The price they had paid echoed forward through generations. Steel breaks. Men endure. His father had been right, the tanks were gone. But the men, or what remained of them, carried forward, carried the weight, carried the memory, carried the responsibility to ensure that such prices, once paid, were not wasted on petty hatreds and small ambitions. That was command. That was the cost. That was the honor of having survived when better men had not. Brennan looked back one last time at the wall, at the names that would outlast his memory of them, at the monument to sacrifice that would stand long after everyone who understood its true meaning was gone. Then he climbed into his nephew's car and let himself be driven home through streets that had never known war, past people who had never faced its choices, into a world his generation had bought with blood and terror and the absolute refusal to quit. The sun set over Arlington. The names on the wall caught the last light, glowing briefly before shadow claimed them. And 3 old men, survivors of Tunisia and Sicily and Italy and France and Germany, carried their burdens into whatever time remained, knowing they had done what they could, been what they had to be, paid what was demanded. It would have to be enough, because it was all they had, all anyone ever had, the courage to face impossible choices, the strength to endure unbearable costs, the grace to remember that steel breaks but men endure, and that endurance, not victory, was the truest measure of what they had become. The story ended where all war stories end, not in triumph, not in glory, but in the quiet recognition that some prices are worth paying, some lessons are worth learning, and some bonds are worth dying to protect. The men of C Company had learned those lessons in the desert of Tunisia, had carried them through years of combat, had brought them home to children and grandchildren who would never fully understand but could benefit from the world those lessons had helped create. That was enough. It had to be, because there was nothing else. Just memory and honor and the absolute certainty that they had done their duty to the men who trusted them, to the crews who depended on them, to the future they would never see but had helped make possible. The war was over, had been over for 40 years, but for the survivors, it never really ended. They just learned to carry it better, to shoulder the weight without being crushed, to remember without being destroyed. Steel breaks, men endure, and in that endurance lay whatever redemption war could offer, whatever meaning could be salvaged from mechanized slaughter and industrial death, whatever small victory could be claimed in the face of loss too great to measure and sacrifice too deep to honor, except through the simple act of remembering. They remembered, they endured, and that finally was enough.